Folks, my name is Ross Evans. I work for Navionics. We're excited tonight. We've got Rodney Woten. He's going to talk about late ice tactics. I want to give you a couple of quick understandings if you've never been with us before. Navionics does these very frequently. You can tune in live or on our website. At the bottom of our website on our front page is all of our listings of all of the webinars we've ever done. So we've got just a ton of information on it, but we're excited because we're expanding a little bit more into doing a few more of these with ice fishing. So we're real excited about that. Now, just a couple of quick things so that you understand it. There's a question and answer area on your device. So if you're on a phone or an iPad, it might be in a different spot, but it's either going to be on the top or the bottom of your device, and you can click on that and type a question. What we generally do is I'll have Rodney give the presentation. We'll give a lot of questions and answers at the end. And if there's something that I can answer in the background, I'll go ahead and fire that off to you as an answer, but we'll hold all the questions to the end, and we'll have a little question and answer period. So with that, we are set to go. Rodney Woten, ICE team member. How long have you been a member, Rod? It's quite a while from what I understand.
About 10 years probably now, yeah.
Very highly recommended from the ICE team. He's a member of the Clam. You can see Jason Mitchell, Elite Series behind him. We're excited. Obviously, late ice is coming faster than we maybe want it to this year. But with that, we're going to turn it over. Rod, I'm going to shut my camera off, mute myself, and you're in charge, man. Have fun.
Okay, sounds good. All right, well, I want to welcome everybody to a cold and windy and somewhat snowy Stewart, Iowa. We're tucked away nice and warm here in the Woten Bungalow. You know, our ice season has been shortened a little bit because we didn't get first ice until much later than we wanted to. And, you know, we kind of divide the ice fishing season into 3 distinct periods: first ice, midwinter, and then late ice. And I think we're already coming to that midwinter period. Midwinter's kind of known for the fishing being slower, it's tougher. And, you know, if you ask anybody which one is their favorite to fish, everybody's either going to say early ice or late ice, but I think the majority of the people are going to pick late ice, and there's a lot of good reasons for that. And so we'll delve into that a little bit tonight, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why it's so good, and also some tactics that you can use to make sure you have good success fishing this late ice period. So with that, we'll get into the content here. So I always like to start talking about late ice. First thing I talk about is safety. Safety is important anytime we're on the ice, but it's especially important at first ice because we're dealing with ice in its infancy, it's still forming. And then at late ice because we're dealing with ice as it begins to deteriorate, and that's what it does as we get into this late ice period. I don't know if you guys have ever had ice cubes in a glass of pop or something, but they deteriorate over time and they get kind of what we call honeycombed. And that's that porosity. They become porous. The same thing happens to the ice on our lakes. It goes through freeze and thaw cycles for the 2 or 3 or 4 months that it's there, and it really takes a toll. It's a lot different than the first ice we see, you know, early in the season. That ice will form. It's very strong. It freezes somewhat uniformly, but the strength is more uniform than it is at late ice. It's what we call black ice. It's clear, hard ice. A lot of times it's transparent. We can see through it. You know, with that kind of ice, 3 or 4 inches is a safe bet to be able to walk on it. You can't say the same thing about this late ice. Yeah, the porosity just pulls the strength right out of it. If you've ever been out on this ice as a honeycombs, you can actually kick it up with your toe and it comes up in chunks. That's kind of where the honeycomb moniker comes from. So it just doesn't nearly have the strength, and it can change so quickly late in the season. So safety is definitely important. One thing to keep in mind, a lot of people late in the season as the ice starts to melt, or if there's snow on the ice, it'll melt and that water will accumulate on the ice, and that really unnerves some people. And it's actually a good thing because it means that ice is not so porous that water passes through it yet. That ice has still got some some good ice in there somewhere that's containing that water. It's when that water goes through the ice that we really want to be concerned, because then it can be floating slush in some stages. So as long as you see the water on there, that should be a little bit of reassurance. You still want to take the precautions and check as you go, but keep in mind that can be a good thing. So this little item here pictured at the bottom, for those of you who don't recognize that, that's an ice chisel. We also call it a spud bar. If you don't have one, get one. If you're going to ice fish even a couple times a year, you need to have one. They're especially invaluable late and early ice because it allows us to check the ice quickly as we walk, but it's useful year-round. I mean, I can use it in midwinter, chopping an ice house out of the ice that might be melted into the ice and refrozen. There's just 1,001 uses for them. So the most important use is the safety use. Like I said, if you don't have one, get one. So we'll talk about how you use that here on the next slide. So a lot of the early ice safety things apply to late ice too. If you're not practicing all of these, you really should be. The first rule is bring a buddy with you. It's easier to have somebody watch your back. That way somebody always knows where you're at. And the point is not to really have your buddy there as somebody to rescue you if you should go through, because we don't really want to put two people in danger. The buddy is there more as somebody to go for help. Obviously when you're in the ice, you're not going to be able to get out and get your own help. And sometimes shouting and yelling, doesn't reach people. So it's nice to have somebody there that can go and alert rescuers and get them on the way to you. If you can't bring a buddy, at least let people know where you're going to be and when you expect to be home, so that if you miss that time slot, they can run the red flag and try to get figure out where you're at and what's going on. So that's one of the cardinal rules. Something as simple as bringing a rope. Early in the season when I'm on foot, I carry one of the kayak throw ropes. They're nice and contained. They're weighted so they throw very easily. The rope floats, so it's not going to sink. It's really easy to get a hold of because it'll stay on top of the water. And it can mean the difference between being able to get out or being trapped. I mean, something as simple as a rope, a lot of people just don't even think about it. And even, in the midwinter when the ice is good and I've got my snowmobile out there, I've always got a 100-foot coil of rope on my machine. Because not only can you pull people out with it, but you can we've used it to pull snowmobiles out of the lakes before. It's an invaluable tool, but obviously the most important use for it is safety, to get people out of the water. Another important thing is wear your spikes. And I'm not talking about the cleats that go on the bottom of your boots. I'm talking about the spikes that you wear around your neck, that if you go through, if you have ever been through, you'll know how hard it is to get out back onto the ice on your own. With that water on top of the ice, it gets terribly slick, and you can't get any traction to lift yourself up out of the water. Your clothes get heavy from the weight of the water, and so you're lifting that much weight, and it's almost impossible to get yourself out without them. So these spikes have metal tips in them that allow you to stick into the ice and get some traction and pull yourself up. And it's not enough just to have those on your person. You want to keep them accessible, and the best place to do that is around your neck. Most of them lock together, so you're not in any danger of poking yourself with the points, but they're right there, ready to go when you are. When you fall through the water, you're going to be in such shock from the cold water. Number one, you're going to not be able to even breathe for a couple minutes because it'll take your breath away. Number two, the last thing you're going to be able to do is fumble through your pockets and try to find those spikes because your hands are going to be cold. You're not going to have any feeling in them. You want something right around your neck where you can get to them, pop them open, go to town. Wear a PFD. In addition to a PFD, I also like to take a throwable cushion type of flotation device. That's something that you could keep it in the seat of your fish house, and you can throw to somebody should they go through, and at least they got something to hang on to. And you can tie that rope to it, and if you can hang on to it, you can actually use that to help pull them out of the water too. So in addition to a PFD you wear, I almost always have one of those with me too. And PFD is important because most of the people that go through the ice and die, they don't die from hypothermia. People think ice fishing, get wet in the water, they think hypothermia, but actually most of them die from drowning. And that happens within minutes. Like I said, your clothes will get heavy, it'll try to pull you down, and you'll drown before hypothermia ever becomes an issue. So it's important that that you stay afloat. That buys you valuable time. If you can at least stay afloat, that'll buy you 15 or 20 minutes for rescuers to get to you. Then you can worry about hypothermia, but I'd much rather try to recover from hypothermia than I would from drowning. Drowning is instantaneous. Hypothermia is a slower process. If you can get out and get warmed up, you're going to be in a lot better shape. In addition to those flotation devices, I also use what's called a nebulous, and you can see what the nebulous is. It's in the upper right corner of the sheet there. And you can also, if you look real close to the picture of my snowmobile down below, you can see I have it mounted kind of on the side towards the rear behind the passenger seat there. The nebulous is an inflatable flotation device. It inflates to about the size of a rowboat, inflatable rowboat. And it is actually tethered to my snowmobile by a structural member. And if my snowmobile should break through, it will actually support my snowmobile so that my snowmobile won't go to the bottom. So it'll be easier to retrieve. And then also it inflates to this big lifeboat that I can actually climb into if I have the strength. It's got grab ropes all the way around it. So at least, very least, I can hook an arm through it and hang there until somebody can get to me. And then again, I'm not going to drown. It just becomes important at that time that I get out of the water before hypothermia sets in. So it does buy me more time, and it helps me rescue my equipment too. So another pretty important piece of equipment. They cost about $400, but how much is your life worth? If I know the cost to rescue a machine from water that's not too terribly deep runs at least $400. So it's worth it right there to me, let alone what it can do, to save a life. So great piece of equipment. And then the spud bar that we talked about on the first page. So like I mentioned, it's a chisel. It's a nice chisel. It's got a sharp edge. They weigh about 20 pounds, so they're pretty heavy, but they're heavy for a reason. You stick your hand through the loop at the top and you stab the ice as you go. You strike it as hard as you can, which doesn't take a lot of effort because, like I said, the bar weighs 20 pounds. So it's going to pack quite a wallop every time it hits the ice. And with each one of those wallops, that spud bar is going to go through about an inch of ice. So if you can strike that ice 3 times and it doesn't go through, then you're in pretty good shape and you can continue to walk. Now, a lot of guys will drill with an auger, check the ice in as they go out. And that works too. It's just not nearly as efficient. With a spud bar, I can hit it 3 times. Looks good. I'll keep moving. I'll take a couple steps, hit it 3 more times. And if you repeat that process, you can see it's actually pretty quick, and you can test ice very quickly and get to where you want to fish. If you're drilling holes with an auger, number one, you're going to tend to take more steps between your checkpoints, just because it is a little more work and it takes a little more time, and you're going to be a lot slower going. So the spud bar is really the way to go. So like I said, on the first page, if you don't have a spud bar, definitely get one. Okay, so in order to understand why late ice is such a magical time, we really kind of have to understand all the transitions that the fish go through, and they kind of move seasonally. Even in seasons, they do a lot of movement, and there's reasons behind those movements. So understanding what some of those reasons are can help you present the right lure. It can help you be in the right location. It can help you present the right cadence, right presentation. Are they aggressive? Are they neutral? Are they negative? All those things can be explained by the things that are driving them to be where they are at during different points of the season. So early ice, as I mentioned, is a good time to fish. A lot of people like to fish early ice. Since the ice has just formed on the water, there's still lots of oxygen dissolved in the water, so fish breathe very easily. So typically fish are in the shallower water. A lot of times there'll be weeds or some kind of living cover in that water. Those weeds will give off oxygen, so that oxygen cycle keeps replenishing. Shallow backwaters, if you ever fish some of the Mississippi waters or some of the other major river systems, they have backwaters that are shallow. Early ice, those are really great places to be. On the more natural lakes, we've got these bays, shallow, weedy. Those are almost always good bets for panfish at early ice. So you want to make sure and pay attention to those, not only because you catch fish then in early ice, but the transitions, things always cycle around. And so by the time we get to late ice, things have come full circle, and a lot of these fish will be back in these same early ice locations where we found them then. So that's, you want to make mental notes when you're catching fish early ice, because that's definitely a place you want to check come late ice, because those fish should be coming back. So midwinter, this is kind of the toughest part of ice fishing season. Fishing can be good at times during the midwinter period, but there are long stretches where it can be really tough. The fish are under a lot of stress. You know, a lot of times by this time of year, we'll have a lot of snow on the ice, which pretty much cuts off the light below the ice. And even if we don't have snow, the ice will thicken and it will cloud as it goes through thaw and freeze cycles. And that clouding is going to reduce that light penetration. And so not only does that stress the fish, but it also means so weeds depend on sunlight to grow. They depend on that photosynthesis. So when that light is cut off, those weeds start to die. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, you know, the weeds are an oxygen producing machine down there. So once those weeds die off, that oxygen production ceases. So it's a bad thing for fish too. It's kind of a double whammy too, because as those weeds decay, they actually start to consume oxygen. So not only are they not producing oxygen anymore, but the decay starts to consume it. You know, as the winter wears on, those weeds become ghost towns. There's so little oxygen there that the fish move to deeper water, not only for more oxygen, but a lot of the forage that those fish were chasing in those shallows have also moved out. And so those fish are following the forage, whether it's bugs or you know, bait fish, those types of things. So midwinter, you're going to find fish more in the main basin areas of the lakes. You know, crappies are notorious for suspending over the basin area at midwinter. The mud flats, you know, a lot of times on midwinter, that's where the perch are roaming. You'll find walleyes out there. Sometimes you'll even find the bluegills out on the mud flats. Sometimes they'll even suspend like crappies. It just depends on the lake. And then also these sticky bottom areas. So these are the areas that are at the base of a sharp break. Sticky bottom areas are kind of unique because the sediment that falls down that break over the years will form a mud at the bottom that's perfect consistency for these burrowing insects to live in, because they can make their holes, their burrows, and they don't collapse, but it's also not so hard that they can't burrow in it. So it's a perfect consistency for bugs to live in. And anywhere you get those bugs, you're going to have perch and bluegills especially stack up. You'll probably also have crappies there. So when you get those panfish there, the predator fish, you know, the walleyes and the pike, they're going to start coming around too, because they're going to be chasing those panfish. So, you know, again, it's a big circle, but those are the kind of areas midwinter that you want to look for. So there's definitely a transition that goes on there. There'll be a movement. And if you are on the water a lot every day in the winter, you'll kind of see as one phase ends and the other phase starts, and you'll notice the fish populations are getting a lot slimmer. And if you go out and fish these deeper areas, you'll find them out there. So as midwinter starts to wind down, you come into the late ice period. And late ice is kind of like the regeneration period. We'll get some warmer days, so any snow that we had on the land will start to melt and run off into the you know, the drainage, and eventually end up in our lakes. And so that water is going to be a little warmer than the water in the lake because it's meltwater, and it's also going to, you know, pick up more oxygen as it flows toward the lake. So it's going to bring fresh oxygen in, and it'll also pick up sediment, little bugs, microscopic organisms that are kind of a fresh food source for the fish. So those will all start flowing into the lakes. You know, we're getting closer to the sun, so the things start to get warmer as winter nears an end too. So that starts to warm up the whole lake as a general. But those shallow areas, you know, the ones, especially if they have a dark bottom, whether we, you know, dark mud or a darker sand, you know, that dark color attracts heat. So those are going to start to warm up even faster than the main lake. So there's going to be warmer water there before there is anywhere else. So those fish are going to be attracted to those areas because you know, that water's warmer there. They're ready for spring. They're tired of being cold all the time. So they're ready to start warming up. So, you know, as the snow melts that actually is on the lake, it'll add to that runoff, but it'll also start to allow more sunlight to penetrate as it melts. And as the ice thins, more sunlight is going to start to penetrate too. What that does is it, you know, starts kicking off that weed growth again. Weeds will start to green up well before ice out. So it's definitely a good thing for that snow and the ice to thin, even though it may make it harder for us to get out there to the fish. But as those weeds begin to grow and produce oxygen, that makes those shallow areas all that much more attractive to fish. They got warmer water. They've got, you know, some sediment that has bugs and microscopic things, you know, things they can eat that are washing in there. And then they got fresh oxygen coming in too. So, you know, fish will feel that, and the days are starting to get longer. So their metabolism is naturally going to start to kick up a little bit. So they're in search of places like that, and they're naturally attracted to them. So they're going to start to transition, you know, to those types of things, to those types of areas. And again, if you're out there every day in the winter, you'll start to see these transitions happen. You may have been fishing a midwinter pattern for a week or two, and you notice that all of a sudden the fish just aren't out there in the basin like they were. You're not finding the suspended crappies, and it's because they've already started the transition toward those shallower areas. Another really neat thing that happens at late ice is that, so we've already established that the shallow areas are the ones that are going to thaw first. Well, the whole shoreline of the lake is the shallow area. So that's why, the lake always opens up first at the shoreline. Late ice, a lot of times, if you can get onto this ice slab still, you got good fishable ice. It's just a question of getting across that open water between the shoreline and that ice slab. A lot of times we'll plank out and do those types of things. But as that happens, that ice was tied to the shore at the time. But when that shoreline opens up, that ice slab is going to lift and float on top of the water because it's not tied to the shoreline anymore. And in the really shallow areas, there will be weeds that are actually grown into the bottom of the ice. They might be dead weeds, but they're grown into that bottom of that ice. So when that ice lifts, it pulls those weeds out of the muck in the bottom, and there's burrowing insects that have burrowed down in there for the winter. There's all kinds of things that fish can eat, and so those are all pulled up and dispersed into the water column, and that really gets the fish going again too. So there's a lot of things happening at late ice that are really getting these fish fired up. They've been not eating very much all winter long because their metabolism is so slow. So when they come out of this funk, they are really, really hungry. So this is one of the reasons that late ice is really a great time to be out there fishing. So we've touched on some of these already, but now we'll dive into a little bit to how we can use some of this information to allow us to better catch or have more success at the late ice. So as I've already told you, fishing during late ice period can be phenomenal. I mean, a lot of guys, that is the time to fish for them, is late ice. And like I said, all these seasonal changes that we just talked about on the previous slide, they're causing these fish's metabolism to ramp up. They're getting excited. They're super hungry. A lot of these, you catch a suspended crappie midwinter out in the basin, and if you clean any of them, there's probably very little in their stomachs because they're out just up there. The reason they're out there, they're suspended over the basin. They're just kind of in a state of suspended animation almost. They're out there to take advantage of anything that might be in the water column. They don't have to chase it. They just drift around there, and if you drop it in front of their face, they're going to eat it. But other than that, they're not eating much. They're not expending the calories because they're trying to conserve them. Anytime they have to chase something down, they got to spend calories. And if there's more calories spent than what they get when they eat that item, then they're at a negative, they're at a loss there. So they can't survive doing that. So they just kind of wait out that midwinter period. And once things start to look more spring-like, then things get fired up again and they start coming in. So one of the things we can take from that is that fish are going to start feeding more aggressively. So this is a great time to start using those larger, more aggressive baits. One of my favorites for those late ice crappies especially are your hard baits or your swim baits, like your chubby darters and your jig and rapalas and those types of things. Fish those a lot. You catch a lot of big crappies on those because they're tired of eating bugs. They're ready to actually eat some bait fish. So when they see one of those swimming baits darting around under there, that's exactly what they're looking for, and they're going to hammer it. Big spoons are good too. Since these fish are no longer in that super slow metabolism, they're willing to chase a little more. So now's the time to use those spoons that have a little more flash, a little more vibration in the water column, because fish are willing to travel a little further this time of year to get to those. You bounce one of those around in midwinter, and you're only appealing to a very small radius of fish. Fish aren't going to come from a long ways away, even though there's a lot of flash and a lot of vibration there. But in the the late ice period, fish are coming in from further away to those things that attract them. So it's also a good time if you still want to jig fish. We catch a lot of fish on jigs late ice, but go ahead and bump up that jig size a little bit. A lot of times, sometimes you get them not wanting that smaller jig. They want the bigger jig because, again, they're looking for as many calories as they can get in one gulp. So those bigger jigs, a lot of times, will trigger a bite. So go bigger, go flashier, go louder. Now's a good time for super bright glow colors. Whatever you can do to really get those fish fired up, get them attracted to you, and get them on a feed. A really good technique for me, and I use this year round, but it's really effective at late ice, is I always, when I'm out searching with my Vexilar, checking holes, I'm always carrying two rods with me. One I call my search rod, and one is my finesse rod. And my search rod will have a pretty good sized spoon on it, or a chubby darter, one of those really aggressive, high vibration, high flash lures. And that's what I'll go from hole to hole checking. If we're really moving fast and what I like to call our hurry up offense, we won't even stop and fish a hole unless we see fish in there, especially if we're fishing for crappie or perch, where it's really easy to see them when you drop the flasher in. Sometimes when we're fishing a little more thoroughly, we'd like to slow things down a little bit. We'll actually jig every hole, a couple of minutes. We won't spend a long time there. But that's when we use that bigger, flashier bait, try to draw some of those fish in from further away. Now, if we get them coming in and they're still not sealing the deal, they're not attacking that bait that we've got down there, means they're not super aggressive yet. They're still a little neutral. But that's okay, because I know at least they're there and they're looking. And as long as I can get their interest, then I can switch it up on them. I'll drop down as a smaller jig, or maybe a smaller spoon, or even a spoon with a dropper chain, something that's got a little more finesse to it. And a lot of those fish that I can't catch on that search lure, if I switch it up on them and drop that finesse down, I can usually seal the deal on that. So that's a really nice 1-2 punch. I keep both rods with me, so I don't have to go run back and grab a different rod out of the rod case. I stick one in each of the rod holders right on the Vexler, so I can just pick it up and carry it all at once. I can carry that in one hand and my electric auger in the other hand, and I can just move. And so that's a really great way to cover water, to identify fish, to attract fish, and also a good way to eliminate non-productive water. So give that a try sometime. But as we said, these fish are going to start to transition. And so we're not always going to find them deep in the basin where they were at, but they're also going to be completely in the shallows yet. They're somewhere in between. And one of the most effective things you can do is especially if you've been out there all season, you were out there early ice, you know where those fish were at. If you're out there midwinter, you know where those fish are at within. If you draw a straight line between those two places where you're catching fish, and you search along that line, sooner or later you're going to intersect those fish, because they'll be in transition there somewhere. And it's just as easy as just drawing a straight line, drilling some patterns. A lot of times if you get with a partner, or even a team of guys, 3 or 4 of you can really have 2 guys drilling holes and 3 or 4 guys fishing holes right behind them. Once you find those fish, find out where they're relating to, in what stage of that transition they're at, then you can fish them. But a lot of times just figuring out, okay, I know they're not in the basin anymore. I know they're not in the shallows yet. They got to be somewhere in between. And that's a really effective way to find them. But again, drill lots of holes. Don't spend too much time at any one hole unless it shows fish activity, because you may have a lot of water to cover between their midwinter hole and the shallow. So you may not have time to spend a lot of time at any one hole. So you may want to do the hurry up offense, like I said, where you just, unless you see a fish in that hole, you don't need to stop to fish it. This time of year, I usually like to spend, like I said, a couple minutes at each hole, see if I can draw something in. If not, then I'll move on. So that's a really good tactic. During this transition period, one of the really great things to look for is drop-offs and break lines. So these drop-offs, they'll be at the top of these sticky bottom areas that I talked about. The break lines, that's just where it breaks over. And fish will actually use these. These are nice because depending on the weather, a lot of times if fish are transitioning shallow, especially crappies, and the weather gets nasty in the spring, they'll actually push back into deeper water a little bit and kind of back off on that transition until the weather's better. Then they'll start to slide shallow again. Well, these drop-offs give them instant access to shallow water or deep water. So they can hang off that drop-off, and if the weather gets nasty, they're going to drop back into that deeper water. And if the weather stays good or gets even better, they're going to keep coming in shallow. So you want to look for those drop-offs. And you know that those drop-offs are bug-rich areas at the base and the sticky bottom areas. So you kind of want to start at the bottom, and if they're not there, then they're moving somewhere up that break line towards that shallow where you caught them in early ice. So pay special attention to those, because they will definitely hold the fish for you. So just more of the same thing. These are some more general kind of rules of thumb. Hole patterns. So when we fish deeper, we like to drill holes further apart. And part of it that drives that is how big an area we're fishing. When we're chasing midwinter perch out over these mud flats, we're drilling areas out that are the size of 3 football fields. So you're not going to drill a hole every 6 feet. Sometimes it's 10 or 15 yards apart. Sometimes it's more than that. You kind of have to feel it out as you go. But as a general rule of thumb, the deeper you're fishing, the further apart you're drilling your holes. And as you fish shallower, you want to drill them closer together. And the way to think about that is, in deep water, if you drop a lure down, there's more fish that can see it, right? They've got better range of vision. Fish from way further out we'll be able to see it. In shallow water, you drop that lure down, there's not near as much space between the bottom of the ice and the bottom of the lake. So there's just not that visibility there. So that's why those holes are closer together when we're shallower, because we're actually covering a smaller sphere of water when we're shallow. When we're fishing deep, that sphere is much bigger because we cover more water. The fish have better visibility, so they don't need to be nearly as close together. We can start to draw some of those fish in when we're deeper out there. So that's kind of like how I like to think of it. It's a great rule of thumb. You don't want to waste a lot of time drilling close holes when you're deep, but when you're shallow, if your holes are too far apart, you're going to probably miss a lot of fish. Search patterns when you're drilling. Be smart about it. Don't just go willy-nilly drilling holes randomly. There has to be some method to your madness. We like to drill grids. Sometimes we'll do circular patterns. Whatever you do, make sure it's easy to know that you've fished all those holes you've drilled. If you just go drilling holes randomly, you get to the point where, I don't remember if I fished that hole. You get lost. But if you have a nice grid, you can start at one corner, work your way across, come down the next row, back the other way. You'll know when you're done that you've fished that entire grid and you've covered that entire area effectively. So be really smart about your drilling. Don't just go random with it. We also like to do the tag team approach. Even if it's just two of you, and we do this a lot when we're tournament fishing or pre-fishing for tournaments. One guy will be running the drill, one guy will be coming up behind with Vexilar looking for fish, and we'll just keep moving until we find fish. If we start to find pretty good concentrations of fish, then we can stop, regroup, kind of drill out that area where we're finding more fish, and hopefully fish, find out everything that area has to give up as far as fishing. Stealth tactics can become important. They're important at early ice too. Up here in Iowa, we get to fish Lake Okoboji, and Lake Okoboji is well known for its gin clear waters, they call it. And those water is so clear that in 20 feet of water, you can look down your hole and you can see everything. You can see clear to the bottom, and it's just like fishing in an aquarium. Unfortunately, this year has not been that way. The water's been very dirty. But we've been out there at early ice when the ice is really clear, and you can walk out and just from your footsteps, you can actually see fish darting away. So when the shallower you fish, the more important it is to be quiet. That's hard to do when you're drilling holes. So one of the things that we'll actually do is we'll go out, we'll drill an area if we're fishing really shallow, and then we'll actually back off and kind of let the area cool down. And 15 or 20 minutes later, we'll come in just on foot with just what we need to fish, and then we'll fish. Give those fish a chance to settle down. All the noise is dissipated. And, a lot of people get worked up about, well, gas auger makes more sound than a electric auger. And there's actually been research done that shows that the sound, the important sound part is actually the blade cutting the ice. That's what makes the sound. So from a fish's perspective, a gas auger doesn't really make any more noise than an electric auger. They do know what makes a lot of noise is if you use a spud bar to open up an old hole or to make a brand new hole, that pounding noise will really affect the fish. So that's something to keep in mind too. Likewise, walking around up there with your cleats on, a lot of times can set them off too. So sometimes when we sneak back in, we'll actually slip our cleats off and come in, ultimate stealth, so they don't hear us up there. So that's something to keep in mind, because late ice a lot of times is a very shallow bite. So it applies as much to late ice as it does to early ice. Things to key in on, and some of these are the same things you key in. Edges are important for fish. Just like the deer hunter, they look for edges of fields. They look for edges between forest and cropland. They look for the edges between water and land, so like creeks and those types of things. Same thing can be said for fish. It's just the edges are different. So we're looking for weed lines, the edges of the weed lines. And so when we say that, we think the outside edge of a weed bed, right? That's a weed line. But also a different kind of weed line is openings in the weed. That's a circular weed line. And those, for me, have been one of my favorite places to fish. Fish will use those. They'll actually hide in the weeds, and they'll ambush things that drop into those openings. So they'll use those like mini weed lines within a weed bed. So if you can find those, one of my favorite, whenever I'm fishing weed beds, especially when I can sight fish and I can look down and I can see those things, if I can find an opening where I can see sandy bottom through the weeds, it's, as big as a basketball or even as big as a laundry basket, that's where I'm going to fish, because I know that fish will come into those openings, ambush prey, and then they'll drift back into the weeds again. So those are gold mines if you can find them. Travel corridors. Now, these may not be as well defined, A lot of times we don't even realize what it is that's making the fish use those corridors, but we see it a lot when we are sight fishing, that fish use certain corridors just like humans use interstate highways. They've got corridors where, if you're 3 feet off of it, you won't even see a fish. But if you're right on top of that corridor, you're going to have fish coming from both directions, and it's going to be nonstop action. So sometimes those are hard to find, and a lot of times the only indicator is the quantity of fish that we're seeing, and the volume, the frequency that they come by. But you want to keep drilling holes until you can identify some of those travel corridors, because they are a great place to catch fish too. And sometimes it's not even, if a lot of times late ice, there won't be weeds yet. They'll just be starting to get green. So that's why we want to key on bottom transitions. When does it change from rock to mud, or where does the sand turn to gravel? Because fish will use those too. They'll follow those just like it's a travel corridor for them. So, and that's easy to tell without even sight fishing. We can actually tell just from the readings on our flashers, is this a hard bottom right next to a soft bottom? So those are definite edges that we want to pay attention to too. A lot of people make lake map reading and finding fish really complicated, but just if you can think to look for edges, whatever shape that might be, edges help concentrate fish. And if you can find those, then you'll find the fish. One thing that we like to look for, so curly leaf pondweed is an aquatic weed that actually doesn't die in the winter. It may slow down, but it still continues to grow. So it stays green year round. So if you can find large beds of that curly leaf pondweed, it's definitely worth a check to see if there might be fish in it, especially if it's a lake where a lot of the other weeds have died off, but there's still some curly leaf pondweed in there that's green. There's a good chance that a lot of those fish have moved into that green pondweed, just because it's still going to put off oxygen and they can still breathe. So that's a really good one. And it seems like more and more lakes these days have that. Again, I talked about this with my search lure. Start big, downsize later. Start big, at least you're going to draw the fish in, know their fish if they're in the area. If they refuse it, then you can downsize, but you're going to find a lot more fish that way than if you start small. If you start small, you may get a lot more biters that come in, but you also may get other fish that just totally miss it, that would at least be interested in your bigger offering, even if they didn't bite it. And one key that I see a lot of people make mistakes. I have to chuckle anytime I'm out and I see a popular weed bed, one of those community spots. There'll be places where there's piles of weeds behind the holes. The guys have been fishing down in the weeds, and they'll snag it, and they'll pull up weeds, and they'll clean their hook off, and they'll go right back down. They're fishing down in the weeds. I'm not saying you can't catch fish there, but you really got to work for the fish that you catch there. If you're fishing above the weeds, you're forcing fish to come up to that. And when we fish even deeper water, that's the game, right? The game is to bring that fish up, make him chase your jig up. And the higher you can fish, you can get that fish to chase your jig, the better the chances that fish is going to commit, right, and bite. So it's the same thing. We're looking for those active feeders. I'm going to refer to sight fishing because I do a lot of sight fishing, and that's how I've learned a lot. When high pressure comes through and those fish shut down, you can see them. They're going to hunker down to the wigs, and they're just going to camp there. And you can sometimes drop it right on their nose, and they're not even going to care. That high pressure has them feeling so full that they are not even interested in eating at all. So we're not interested in those fish that are down in the weeds. We're interested in the ones that are willing to come up out of the weeds. Those are the active feeders, and those are the ones that we want to catch. You could spend all day trying to get those ones buried in the weeds to bite sometimes, and it's an exercise in futility, just like banging your head against a wall. So fish above the weeds, fish for those active feeders, and you're going to be a lot less frustrated. So keep that in mind. So sight fishing, one of my favorite tactics for late ice. It's usually done in shallow and clear water. Now, shallow is relative. Up at Lake Okoboji, we can fish 20 feet, and it's crystal clear most years. But the shallow water almost always means weeds. So weeds are important, late ice, early ice. Maybe even a little more important late ice, because a lot of the weeds are gone. So if you can find weeds that are sprouting or green weeds, if there aren't fish in it right now, there will be soon. So keep that in mind for your next trip out there. There were weeds coming up here already. I want to hit that in a week and see if the fish are in there. Very important. So yeah, shallow and clear relative terms. Some lakes, if you can see 6 feet, you're doing pretty good. Some lakes, a lot of people may be surprised that they've got lakes near them that they can sight fish. We've got a lake north of the metro here called Big Creek that, during the summer, sometimes it gets so bad they actually have algae warnings, and the water looks like pea soup. And you would never think that in the winter that lake would clear up to where you could sight fish, but it does. in some of the bays and stuff, you can actually fish all the way down to the bottom, 6, 8, 10 feet. And doesn't hurt to check. I mean, you may surprise yourself and you might have sight fishable water near you. So it's worth a look. When you sight fish, you want darkness behind you. There are shelters out. Clam has a shelter out now that's completely black on the inside. I set mine up in the daylight when I built it, closed it on myself, and I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I was amazed how dark it was. So the darker the better. And even if you don't have a fancy shelter, sometimes you can just lay on the ice and put your face over the hole and flip your hood over your head. And you wouldn't believe, as soon as you get that dark background, it's like a movie jumping up on the screen. It's just like day. It's just like watching a movie down below you. So the darker the better. It does have some special equipment. Again, the darker the better. So it'd be a dark shelter, a hood or something over your head. The rods are a lot shorter. Sometimes they're 14 to 16, sometimes as short as 12 inches. And that's because if you had a full-length rod, you'd have to have your hand behind you as you look down the hole and jigged, and you'd end up with a sore neck and a sore shoulder. So the shorter rods put us much closer to the hole. They allow us to look down the holes we fish without being sore or as sore at the end of the day. Sometimes it still wears on you. But there's a lot of benefits to sight fishing too. I mean, as you can tell from my talking, I've learned a lot just by watching the fish, seeing their behavior during different conditions, seeing how they react to different presentations, different colors, different jigs, at different times of the day, different times of the year. There's a lot to learn. One of the most important things that I think you can learn is jig spin. Everybody knows jig spin is bad, right? I mean, that's the whole reason for this inline reel revolution. They don't put the twist in your line like a spinning reel does. So that straight line is rock solid. It doesn't spin. But when you sight fish, you can really see that. I was a bit of a skeptic until I started sight fishing, and I looked down and my jig was just spinning like a helicopter. And I could see these big bluegills that Okoboji's known for. They'd come in, they'd look at it, and then they'd back right off. They wanted to have anything to do with a jig that was spinning. Now, once I got some of the spin out of my line, the twist out of my line, got a jig locked in, it was rocking away, nice and straight, bam, they come in and hit it every time. So things like that really reinforce how important these little details are, because that's what successful fishing is, right? It's paying attention to the little details. And so sight fishing will let you actually see some of those, and seeing is believing. So I'm a big proponent of sight fishing. So these are just some pictures from Okoboji. You can see here in the upper left, there's a bluegill looking at the jig, and you can see here, and then the top right, he actually has the jig in his mouth, and so that's a caught fish, right? I wish. Those bluegills are so quick. That bluegill spit that jig out before the hook could even be set. So that fish swam off, probably laughing at me, and gave me the middle fin as he swam away. But sight fishing, you can see that kind of stuff. You can learn from it. Down here, this is actually a bass that slid in to look at that jig as well. So really cool sights you can see when you're doing that. And then this bottom right corner is that really dark fish house that I was talking about. Clam even went so far as they've got a flap around the zipper, so that when you close the zipper, there's no light coming in around the zipper. The windows have Velcro all the way around, so that there's no chance of any light getting in anywhere from those windows. So it's a great shelter for ice fish, or for sight fishing. I'm so happy they came out with it. So another really cool technique, one of the really neat things about fishing tournaments, especially when you fish some of the bigger tournaments, is you get to fish against guys from Michigan and from Vermont, from Maine, and from the Dakotas, and even from guys from Colorado and some of those places that have ice at elevation. So you get to see a lot of different techniques. You got tight liners, you got sight fishermen, and one of the more unique ones that I didn't see until probably the past 5 or 6 years is it's long rodding. And these guys are really easy to see because they're using 48-inch rods to fish with. And most of these guys come from northern Illinois, southern Wisconsin. I think there's a few. It goes into Michigan a little bit there. Again, it's a shallow water technique, so water usually under 10 feet. The long rods are not only long, so they're unique in that aspect, but they also have the line that goes through the blank of the rod. And that's to keep the line out of the wind, because you stand when you're long rodding. One of the keys to the long rodding, or one of the reasons it's so successful, is you actually stand away from the hole. So you're not casting a shadow, you're not standing directly over the fish, making footsteps that scare them. These long rods allow you to get away from the hole, so they're super stealthy. And the way you use them is most of them have a spring bobber on the end, and you drop the jig down and you fish it from as soon as it clears the ice all the way to the bottom. So you fish the entire water column. And when you do hook a fish, All you do is you lift the fish up, extend your arm as far as you can till it clears the hole, and then you swing the fish into your hand. Take the fish off the hook, then you swing your jig back out and drop it down the hole. So you don't reel very often. And that's why you can see the reel on these in the close-up picture here is pretty basic. There's not much there for drag because you don't use it other than for line storage. So it's a really cool technique, and the guys that have been doing it have really done well on some of the national circuits. So then they hop from hole to hole that way. And one really unique piece of equipment that this requires is it's a long-handled ice skimmer or ice scoop. And a lot of these guys, they actually take like a golf putter, and then they braze on an additional long-handled metal scoop so that they can reach the hole. And a lot of times you'll see them with a rod in one hand and then the scooper in their other hand. And as soon as they catch fish, they lift it out of the hole, and then they put that scooper right underneath the fish. So if that fish were to come off, there's no chance he could fall back down the hole. He'd fall into the scoop. So it's a really fast, really stealthy, really effective technique. And, I know there's some videos on YouTube of guys doing that, so check those out if it's something you're interested in. I don't log rod a lot myself because I'm usually sight fishing, but the guys that do this, they're really good at it, and they do really well in the tournaments too, so it's worth a look. So that's pretty much it for late season ice. Again, it's a great time to be out, but you do want to be careful. Those ice conditions can change so quickly in the late season. The ice just gets weaker and weaker, and just because it's 6 inches of ice, don't assume it's safe, because that porous, that honeycombed ice does not have nearly the strength that good, hard, clear first ice does. So check it with your spud bar as you go. I don't want to discourage you from getting out there because it's great fishing. And a lot of people, when they hear that you have to plank out, they think, oh, what are you doing out there? You guys are crazy. But the ice slab is usually good once you get onto it. It's just getting out to it. So, don't let it discourage you. Just take the precautions. Check it as you go. I think you'll really enjoy catching some of those late ice fish. So, guys, if you've enjoyed what you've seen tonight, check out the Ice Team website. There's videos, seminars, there's articles from the past 10 years there. It's another great source of information. And then, all our sponsors here. And the folks at Navionics, their maps, almost everybody I know uses the phone, the maps on their phone. And they're good for finding those sharp drop-offs, those break lines. They're on those maps. 1-foot contours makes those things really stand out. So if you're not using the Navionics app on your phone, definitely look at it. It's good for late ice. It's good for open water. It's good anytime during the ice season. It's well worth the price. Thanks for listening, guys. Appreciate it.
Hey, Rod, we're going to open it up to a couple of questions here.
Okay.
The folks, if you guys have questions, there's been a couple of them that came in. You can type them on the Q&A area down below. The first one is they were asking, okay, you were talking about the bugs separating from the bottom and kind of keying in on some of that. What are some clues that that's happening? Am I going to visually see that, or is that something that you have enough experience that I'm going to miss it type thing?
A lot of times if you can see the weeds in the ice, and a lot of times you have to see it like an early ice because the ice is clear then. But that's definitely a place I want to come back because I know once that sheet lifts, it's going to happen right there. A lot of times the water will be cloudy there, so if you can drill a hole and you can look, you can see some of the sediment floating in the water. Sometimes it'll give a funny reading on your Vexilar because instead of those weeds coming out of the bottom, they're actually hanging from the ice. So sometimes it'll look like a bunch of clutter on the top of your flasher dial, and the bottom might be kind of open. That's kind of a dead giveaway too. But, usually if the weeds grow this tall in this bay and we've got this much ice this year, you can kind of do the math and figure out where there's probably weeds that are in the ice. And anytime that you see that ring around the shoreline where the ice is pulled away from the shoreline, it's a pretty safe bet that whole ice sheet is floating now and lifted. And there's a good chance that somewhere in those shallow weeds, they've been pulled up by the roots, and there's all kinds of stuff in the water column.
Okay, and to expand upon that, this is more my personal question. Do you see a specific trend, like visually one bug that you can see is better? Should I be trying to pay attention to that, or is that just something that they kind of chew on a little bit of everything?
Yeah, a little bit of both. Sometimes it will be a certain bug, and sometimes, especially if you start catching a lot of fish, they might start coughing up whatever they're eating, especially if they're really gorging themselves on it. They're going to come up. I know a lot of times when we catch perch in deeper water, just because of the pressure, it pushes their swim bladder out and it empties the contents of their stomach. And you can look and you can see, oh, they're eating the mayfly nymphs or bloodworms or whatever it is. But sometimes you can tell what they're eating. sometimes it's just everything that's in the water column.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. Now on I think it was the last slide or the second to last slide, Rod, there, you were talking about those long rods.
Yep.
And I noticed the Frabo one, somebody was asking on the question and answer area, do you have a specific brand rod? I mean, you kind of said some of them are custom.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've heard of this before. This is again, I'm adding to the gentleman's question, but
yep.
What are you recommending?
Most of them, the really good ones, are custom. They're the line through the blank. And I think CNY Customs is one of the ones that makes a lot of them that I know of. Climb actually had at one time a 48-inch Jason Mitchell meat stick. The line was exposed, but it was a lot the same thing. A lot of guys used it for the same purpose. It had the real sensitive tip like the meat sticks do, so you could use that as a spring bobber. And it was 40 inches long, so you could get it out away from you and fish with that way too.
Okay, and I just want to ask this kind of because I know I'm not alone with this question.
Yep.
A guy just doesn't want to use his 5-foot ultralight rod. It doesn't work as effectively in that context.
Yeah. Keeping the line out of the wind makes a big difference because you're standing, right? I mean, you're much more exposed to the wind. It's much more of an issue. So the line through the blanket is a pretty important consideration.
Okay. Okay. You had mentioned a little bit on it. You've got both rods in the rod holder. I'm expounding upon a question that came in. Somebody was asking basically about your auger setup and kind of what you're doing. But it sounds relatively lightweight. What's your preference? Is it an ice condition conversation, or when do you give up the gas and just go to the electric, and when do you give up the electric and go to the hand?
Yeah. So I'm electric almost exclusively now. Electric augers have come to the point where they're pretty good. They're a pretty viable option in almost all conditions. Even the thicker ice, they're going to drain the battery a little faster, but we've got 9 amp-hour batteries out there now that are able. You can get a lot of holes out of even through thick ice. And the lithium-ion technology is fascinating. It's great stuff now. So the batteries are built to last. They're not like the batteries 5 years ago even. And so that enables us to go electric. And I've had this conversation probably 5 or 6 times this year already. And I remember early ice, I was a hand auger guy. That's what I used. I couldn't wait for the ice to get thick enough where I could justify dragging my gas auger out. But then it was heavy, and I had to drag this gas auger around with me all the time. But now I take the same electric auger. It's just a Milwaukee 18-volt drill. It's on the clam drill plate, and use the Vexler or the K drill, the composite bit. Super light. I don't think it even weighs 10 pounds. And so I can actually carry it in one hand and just go. And if you're not using the electric drills yet, you really need to give it a try because I really think it's the wave of the future.
Okay. And then again, somebody was asking about, and this came in kind of midway through the deal. I know this is temperature based, but what do you wear? What are you doing for gear? Is it knee boots? Is it the lightweight gear? What are you doing with gear on yourself?
Yeah. So when I'm on foot, especially late ice, I'm on foot a lot. And I like to carry no more than what I can keep in my pockets. Now, I do wear the ice armor, so I've got a lot of pockets to keep stuff in. And I like to keep my jig boxes as small as possible. I've actually got really small plastics boxes. When I do seminars, one of my favorite questions afterward is guys want to see what I'm keeping my plastics in. And, I used to keep them in the Ziploc plastic bags, but they're such a hassle to get open, get the bait out of, and especially with cold hands. And so I've gone to very small, clear plastic containers, and I can keep 5 or 6 of them in my various pockets and have just about every color of every shape of plastic that I want to use on my person.
Okay.
I can actually fit all my jigs in one larger double-sided jig box, and so I just keep that in one pocket and try to travel as light as I can. I do use a system sometimes that has my flasher mounted to a bucket, and especially in tournaments I use that a lot because I can go from hole to hole, drop the bucket, drop the transducer in the hole, and I've got a place to sit while I fish because, when I'm tournament fishermen, we're doing 2 or 3 days pre-fishing, 2 days tournament, sometimes with the national championships for 2 days. So it's a lot of up and down. I feel like I've been doing squats all year long. So with this bucket, it's not nearly as strenuous. My knees thank me a lot. I've got a place to put the fish. It's got a little pouch on the back that I can keep some tackle in. And so with that and my electric auger, I can go and I've got a place to sit. I've got a place to keep my fish. I've got my tackle. I've got my flasher, my 2 rods again, because it's got 2 rod holders and the auger in the other hand. And unless the weather's really nasty and I want to be inside a fish shelter, I've got everything I need right there. And I can move pretty quickly with that just on foot.
Okay. I think it's the last question, and unless somebody wants to fire it off an extra one here. Somebody was asking about, you had mentioned the finesse and the search.
Yep.
Are you, because you're keeping it kind of compact and are you a believer in keeping it simple on colors, or are you a believer in kind of having a little bit of everything, or how are you facing that,
Yeah. I actually like to use a lot of color. I think some days it doesn't matter. I think some days it's a deal breaker. But I like to use plastics a lot rather than live bait, and I let the plastics be my color. Okay. So most of the time when I have a jig or a spoon tied on, it's silver or gold, because those are really good neutral colors. I don't have to carry a whole array of colors. Rather than a whole array of colored jigs, I carry different profiles of the jigs. I'll carry vertical, I'll carry horizontal. Some will be a 45, some will be segmented, some will be straight. And then with all my plastics, I can just change the color out, and I don't even have to retie a jig, so it's actually quicker that way too.
Okay. I think we've reached the end of the question period, Rod. I want to thank you very much. Navionics appreciates all the great information. Folks at home, remember, this will be on the Navionics website. I'm sure it'll be on Rod's, also his personal YouTube page. Probably within 48 hours. So tell your friends if you got good information. This was a load of good information. We appreciate your time tonight, Rod. Thank you very much. And you folks at home, I appreciate you tuning in. And until next time, check the Navionics website. We've got tons of webinars coming up, and just a whole variety of different subjects. And maybe we'll talk Rod into coming back and talking transitions into spring panfish or something like that. But we'll go down further the road. We appreciate your time, and everybody have a great evening. Thanks, Rod.
Thanks for the opportunity, guys.
You bet. Thank you.
Yep. Bye.